Hello class, welcome back to our last set of notes for Unit 2, Populations. Today we'll be discussing population policies, urbanization, and ecological footprints. It's worth noting here that we're actually in our course exam descriptions Unit 5 for the AP Environmental Science, discussing 510 impacts of urbanization and 511 ecological footprints. I think these topics are worth noting some discussion here in populations as we talk about how populations change and impact the resources that are available. So starting off, we're going to look at a quick relationship here of the IPAT equation. All right, IPAT stands for influence, population, affluence, and technology. All right, affluence and technology require a little more explanation. When we say affluence, we're talking about consumption per person, so the amount of resources needed, and technology is really the impact per person. Technologies that allow us to reduce the amount of energy or other resources consumed per person. So starting off, our total influence on the planet is really our population, right? So our population here, which is going to be the greater population, the more resources we need. So that's a negative factor, right? Affluence here, consumption per person, as we just use more stuff, more resources or energy, that can be a negative factor. And then we move on to technology. Well, technology typically can be a positive factor in terms of reducing the impact per person. So that should be our goal as a society, is to develop technologies that reduce the impact per person. So more fuel-efficient cars, more efficient agricultural systems that produce less waste but more food. Those things will help to offset the cause of the problem. So this is really what we're saying. The cause of the problem is the population and the affluence. The cleaning it up is the technology portion. So reducing our impact falls in here. We can lower the consumers. That's one way we can do it for a solution. We can lower the consumption per person, and then we can produce more efficient use of resources as a whole. The next big concept we'll be discussing here is a concept of an ecological footprint. An ecological footprint is defined here as the area of land that would be required to provide a population with all resources and process all of its waste. Essentially, ecological footprint is pictured here, and the idea that the footprint and the biocapacity are kind of interrelated. Our footprint is the consumption of these resources and the amount of waste generated. So this is all our negative stuff that we do. Over here in our biocapacity, this is the positive stuff that our planet is able to do and deal with. So our footprint is our balance between the resources consumed and waste produced versus the Earth's ability to produce the resources and process the waste that we produce. Quick note on populations here, just discussing GDP, so our gross domestic product, one more time, and ecological footprints, and try to relate these population concepts to ecological footprints. So our Med-C, more economically developed countries, tend to have higher GDPs. This is the value of the total country's products and services that they produce. Their affluence, their amount of consumption per person, is 2 times the energy in their diet as a Med-C nation. And typically animal products are much higher in consumption. Coming with that is higher use of energy, which creates greater CO2 production as far as pollution goes. Med-C countries tend to have a lower GDP, less animals consumed equals a lower grain consumption also, because we're not needing to feed those animals so much grain. So total resources are much, much less here. This diagram quickly shows it's a little bit older diagram, but still showing the relationship between our nation and ecological footprint. So the United States, talking about obviously ecological footprint measured in planets here, the United States is using per person 5 planets worth of resources if everyone lived like we did. So if everyone on the planet, all 7.5 billion people, live like we did, we need 5 Earths to support that. So the resources are not being distributed equally. We're using much, much more than many other people. But still a Med-C nation, right? UK, Med-C nation, we're talking about 3.4 planets if everyone lived like they did. Argentina are down to 1.7, still Med-C nation here. South Africa down to 1.5. China is living at about 1 planet. India is at 0.4. This is, remember, resources per person. The world average is about 1.4 overall. So when we talk about ecological footprints, it really comes down to resource consumption per person. That affluence numbers are really huge, huge thing. As populations increase, the impacts of urbanization become more clear. We have local, global, and urban impacts. Local impacts tend to be overuse of resources, so running out of food and water or the need to produce more of those resources. Increasing agricultural yield, to do that requires more fertilizers, pesticides, and causes soil erosion. Global impacts, we end up increasing demand and burning of fossil fuels to increase our need for energy primarily, and that increases atmospheric CO2 as a result of that. The increase in demand for imports and exports for resources. We can import and export resources, but it doesn't change the global carrying capacity. So artificially increases local carrying capacity and does not change global carrying capacity. Remember that was abbreviated as K. We'll just put that right there. Global carrying capacity. Ultimately, when we're discussing impacts of urbanization, the urban impacts themselves, how does this affect society and cities? Most of the population in Med-C nations are in urban areas. Urban sprawl continues to occur, which means growth from the city spills out to suburbs, which takes up rural land or undeveloped land and creates subdivisions and businesses and all the things that we see every day. What this leads to is more impervious surfaces, so things like roads, parking lots, sidewalks. This affects our water cycle in a negative way, in which we create more runoff and less recharge of our groundwater. So this diagram here is explaining that natural ground cover versus a city setting. We're able to have much, much more water get into the groundwater here in these aquifers in a natural setting versus the concrete setting. We have very reduced ability to allow the water cycle to function normally. Government policies, as populations change, governments tend to have a way of intervening to try to hopefully solve problems. One-child policy in China is a really famous one. Massive population growth in the largest country in the world was concerning to China's leaders in the 70s, so they developed this one-child policy to prevent births. Basically, they prevented 400 million births at last estimate. Unintended consequences, definitely a gender imbalance due to son preference, where boys were preferred over girls. So families were choosing to only keep their male children around. It's also leading to an aging population and a shrinking workforce because now population has slowed down and the younger generation is so much fewer people than the older generation. Nigeria has an overpopulation issue. Too many people, too few resources. So family planning has been extensive in Nigeria. Economic growth has continued, and educational programs has continued as well in hopes to drive down average population size, but also increase the economy to support that. Japan has a declining population. So in the future, losing a workforce to replace the older one is a concern in caring for the elderly. Japan has instituted childcare incentives, longer maternity leaves to try to encourage families to maybe have one or two kids instead of 0 or 1 kids. They had to raise the retirement age. So people have to work longer because there's nobody to come up and take their jobs. They've also relaxed some immigration policies to allow some more immigration to support the workforce. Some of the solutions to challenges of population growth that we'll discuss in a lot of detail here. Economic welfare, improving the country's economy, increasing GDP tends to cause fertility rates to decline. So in the long run, this tends to increase quality of life, decrease infant mortality, increase life expectancy, and ultimately increasing the economic welfare of society tends to kind of remove the population issues, at least from overpopulation. Education, promoting education, family planning, economic and educational opportunities for women are all valuable. And then domestic development, improving sanitation, infrastructure, healthcare, all those things are really, really important for this.